All right, I want you to imagine with me that you are out in the woods, walking along a trail, and you come upon the scene that's up here on the screen behind me. This manicured lawn, this nicely constructed, newer looking house. And so you go up to the house and kind of inspect it a little bit and look around and notice some things about it. I think we would universally agree, it doesn't matter where you're from, what your background is, what your culture is, what language you speak. Universally, we would all conclude that obviously this house was there in the middle of the woods purposefully. Someone put it there. They built it, they designed it, they constructed it, all of those things, but there's no possible way whatsoever that this could have happened by accident. Now, to start off, what I want to ask you is, why is that really the only logical conclusion that could be drawn about something like this? What is it about, what characteristics of a house would lead you to conclude that it had a builder, whether it was this house or any house? What are some of the characteristics that would lead you to conclude that it had to be constructed by an intelligent designer? Now, depending on the house, some designers are more intelligent than others, but that's a discussion for another day. Bruce?
Well, you can tell that it had a plan and a design, there's a function to it. So it was purposely built.
Okay, good. So there's planning, there's design to it. Give me some specifics about that, like what are some of the things that you see in a house that indicate planning or design? Brenda, did you have your hand up?
I was just going to say, first thing that came to my mind is something that's come to nothing.
Okay, good. But what if you had all of the raw materials and you didn't start from nothing? We would still reach Brenda's conclusion, which is it couldn't just come out of nowhere. There had to be some sort of organized forces working to take these raw materials and build them into something like this. What are some of the other elements of a house that lead you to the conclusion that it has to have a builder? Wayne?
Well, each part of the house has a set purpose. The roof protects it from the elements. The windows allow light in. The siding protects it from elements. The insulation holds heat, holds it cool. The doors that open and close allow people to enter and exit. And the water, it just goes on and on. There's a purpose for everything that's in that home, whether it's comfort or protection or whatever it is, but there's a purpose for it.
Good. So there's purposeful intent. Things are placed in the home for specific functions. And there are specific systems within the home. Let me illustrate it this way. Wayne pointed out things like roofing or siding or like plumbing, things like that. And it's not just that we see those things within a home, but it's that they are placed where they're most functional. In other words, it wouldn't make sense, or it would be sort of weird if you walked into a house and there were aluminum siding like in the kitchen, you know what I mean? Or if somebody used asphalt shingles as flooring in their bedroom. We would kind of wonder about the intelligence or the design behind that, because those are specific things that are engineered for specific purposes. And so part of the design of a house is that we see that those things are not just designed for specific purposes, but they are constructed in the right order or in the right places to serve those functions. Does that make sense? Is that okay? I was like waiting for some sort of head shaking, and there was none, so I was a little concerned. All right, we're good. If you do have any questions, or if I'm going too fast or any of this, please don't be hesitant to just ask me to say it again or say it a different way. That's just fine. Cindy?
Well, when you look at a house like that, the glass and the wood and the brick and the tile and the linoleum and the fiberglass, none of those things are related. It's not like a tree with leaves and branches on it, or
Okay.
a flower with its petals. None
Good.
of them are related. They have to be made and brought from different places and put together.
Good. So not just the construction itself, but even the materials and their origins or how we come up with those things. As Cindy pointed out, those things all have very different origins. They have different makeups, different processes just to get to the raw materials, and then you have to construct from the raw materials themselves. So very good. Yes, sir. Dale.
the intelligence to design this had to come from somewhere too. People had to be trained.
Okay, good. Good. So it's clear that things like this don't just happen. You know, you can have someone that's relatively intelligent and give them an assignment like this and have it not turn out the way that this turns out, because there's training that's involved too. Maybe something else to think about is when you go up to a house and you start to inspect it closely, you'll also find evidence of like artistry, creativity. If any of you own or if any of you like craftsman style houses or things like that, a lot of older homes kind of have this sort of thing. They have characteristics about them. It's not just the function, but somebody did this to make it look good. And there are elements of that within homes as well, which I think raises an important question. If this was just a matter of something being constructed for functional purposes, how would you explain the creativity? How would you explain the artistry and things that are there really just because they are good to look at? They don't necessarily add anything to the function, but they're appealing in terms of the aesthetics. And I think that's evidence for intelligence as well. Bruce?
Well, on that example, just the shutters, they don't do anything other than
Good.
just to enhance the look of the window.
Good.
So,
But if you're
good point.
if you're deciding between two houses, one of them has shutters and one doesn't, you're going to pick the one with shutters probably every time. Very good. All right, so let's take this concept and let's expand our search, or let's zoom out a little bit and look at the natural world. So the concept from Hebrews 3 verse 4, and obviously this is a verse that, this is not, the context of this verse is not about creation and origins, things like that. But the principle, I think, is a profound one that goes beyond just the context of Hebrews 3. Every house is built by someone. This one, your house, my house. Now let's expand that to look at the created order. What are some of the things that you see in creation, in the natural world, that would indicate to you the same conclusion, that it had to be built by a designer, or it had to have a builder, in other words? What's that? People. Okay, what do you mean?
Just all the design, all the systems, the eye. All the systems that have to work together. There's just some way to design.
Good. Yeah, when we talk about complexity, I think that really maybe the most powerful example of complexity is the human body, the human existence. There are so many things, and we'll get a snapshot of those this morning, but so many things that have to work together cohesively for this to happen, that are really mind-boggling. The deeper that we go and the more we understand those processes, it is unfathomable to think that this could just happen through a series of sequential steps. And I think that that's something that it's not just a conclusion that people of faith reach, but this is something that even people who are in academia, who understand and are starting to figure out the details of a lot of these processes that were obscure before, are starting to realize that this, and not just starting to, people have seen this and reached these conclusions for a long time, that this couldn't just happen naturally or accidentally. Any other observations? What else do you see in nature that might reach the conclusion, or lead you to the conclusion that there had to be a designer? Yes, sir, David.
I think we all understand that an explosion brings chaos and not order.
Good.
But for the Big Bang, people say this explosion created everything. But at the same time, like I said, explosions bring chaos. The Earth has to be so far away from the sun, the moon has to be so far away from the Earth. The Earth has to be, a certain axis for the environment to exist, for the water to exist, for the tides, for oxygen. It just doesn't make any sense that an explosion would create that much order.
Good. So think about that concept. Does anybody know what the term entropy means? Is anybody familiar with that? Entropy? Bruce?
Something left alone goes to disorder.
Good. Yeah, basically it's just a scientific word that means a tendency for things to become more disorderly over time. And as you pointed out, as David pointed out, that's exactly what we see when we look at the natural world, is things become more disorganized in a closed system over time. If you take a system and leave it to itself, it becomes more disorderly. And yet, when we look at the natural world, there's all this order. So if left to itself, nature produces disorder or leads to disorder, how in the world do we conclude that natural processes could lead to all of the order around us? It's counterintuitive to a lot of even the fundamental rules that govern the natural order. So to David's point, that would be one conclusion, one piece of evidence that would lead us to conclude that there had to be a builder in all of this. Artie, did you have a hand up?
Well, now I have two. First of all, I'm going to say everything has a purpose. You're asking, look around nature and see what everything has a purpose. Trees, not only do they provide, but they provide oxygen. They take the carbon dioxide, which we don't use, which we convert oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. They take the carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. It's just everything works together.
Good.
But part of what you were saying about the entropy is that if you really look deep at everything, what so many call evolution in a, how do I want to say this, in a good way, growing better, is not observed. True evolution is always a degradation.
Good. And that's something, we're actually going to look at that even in more detail. Lord willing, we'll do that next week. We'll look at some evolutionary claims that are common and just talk about the logic behind them and how accurately do they fit observation and what we see around us. And oftentimes what we'll find is that the explanations that are given are not any better than an explanation that would come from a biblical perspective. In many cases, I think there's even more of a stretch that you have to make logically to believe in a lot of the claims that evolutionists make. Good. Anything else that you would look at in the natural world and you see and point to and say, okay, that has to be designed or has to be built by some sort of intelligent designer? We could go on for a long time about this, but anything? Cindy?
When you look at just the life cycle and the food chains and that type of the weather and those type of things, well, even when you take just a little tiny piece and go, okay, we raise animals for food. We raise that in the dirt. We eat them. We take the manure that they produce and put it back into the soil and till it in there to rebuild the soil to grow food and so on and so on.
Good.
And literally manure left to itself for long enough creates the richest topsoil you've ever seen. And I mean, that just doesn't happen. I mean, when you think about it, who would think about that? I mean,
Sure.
There has to be design.
Good. So there's a world full, really a universe full of systems that are integrated. Now, let me be fair about this. I'm not standing up here and trying to say that people who believe in evolution have no answers to that. They do have answers. And they defend them well and staunchly. So I don't want it to sound like anybody who believes in anything other than intelligent design or believes in anything other than God doesn't really have an intellectual leg to stand on. There are answers that they will offer. But what I hope that you'll see in this is that I believe logic favors the idea that we are not here by accident or natural processes, but the logical conclusion based on the evidence that we have is that there is a designer behind all of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to look to dive in a little deeper. We could go in a lot of different areas, but we're going to talk about DNA this morning. And so for the sake of time, we're going to dive right into it just because there's a lot I want to try to at least touch on. So for starters, what is DNA? Does anybody... I know there's some questions that you had to dig in on, and some of you said things to me ahead of time like, I've never done so much work in a lesson than this lesson. You made me work so hard to find the answers to this. So if you did a bunch of work, then now's your time to share it with us. What is DNA, and what are its basic building blocks? Cindy?
The DNA is the molecules that carry our genetic material.
Okay, good. Yeah, in a nutshell, I think that's probably the best definition. It's what carries our genetic material throughout the body and from cell to cell. Good. What are its basic building blocks? Did anybody find that out? Any brave, curious soul? All right. So, give a little bit of background here, and then we'll dig into DNA. There are four within the human body, within most created things, most living things. There are four major, what are called macromolecules, like basically big classifications or types of molecules that our body uses or our body is made up of. Carbohydrates, so that would be things like sugars. Lipids, which are things like fats. Proteins, and I think many of us understand what those are, and nucleic acids. DNA is a nucleic acid. It's not the only nucleic acid. There are several others, but it's the most important one for our purposes this morning. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. There'll be a quiz on that at the end of this quarter, so you better know that. And I'll take off for spelling as well. Deoxyribonucleic acid. To simplify this, and I think it can be fairly simple, here's the best way that I've ever heard someone explain it. Just think of a ladder. All DNA is really a ladder that is twisted on itself. So the components of this ladder, just think about a normal ladder that you might use to get up onto your roof or to water your hanging plants at home, something like that. Just a basic ladder, you have rails on either side, and then you have a series of rungs that connect the rails. That's basically how DNA is constructed. The rails of DNA are made up of two things, sugars and phosphates. Sugars and phosphates. So the rail on the left-hand side of this picture, the rail on the right-hand side of this picture, if this were a DNA molecule, it would basically be composed of alternating sugar and phosphate on either side of the rail. What connects those two in the middle, in other words, the rungs, are these things called bases. There are four of them that alternate in DNA, and I'll show you a little bit more about that here in just a minute. But four bases that serve as the rungs, and they're paired. So what I mean by that is, if you basically picture this ladder as being split right down the middle, and you have a rail with half rungs on one side and a rail with half rungs on the other side, each of those half rungs is a base. So one base, half of the rung, is going to connect to another base, half of the rung, and that's what binds those two rails of the DNA strand, or the double strand. That's what binds them together. All right. Any questions about that before we move on? Is that simple enough? So picture this ladder, and as I mentioned, it's going to be kind of twisted on itself. If you could picture a ladder kind of ringing it, if you were strong enough to do that, that would be really the shape of DNA. So the basic building blocks of DNA are called nucleotides. And what a nucleotide consists of is those three things that we mentioned. One sugar, one phosphate, one base. So if you cut this ladder into smaller pieces, basically you'd have like a little section of the rail connected to a half section of the rung. And that's a building block of DNA called a nucleotide. It's not super important. If you don't remember that, that's okay. But that's what it's made up of, is a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. And so all this ladder is basically that sequence repeated to infinity and beyond. So that's DNA. Let's talk about proteins for a little bit, and then we'll talk about the connection between the two. Actually, no, I've got one more thing to show you with DNA. So I mentioned that DNA is like this ladder twisted on itself. If you can see the bottom of this diagram or this graphic up here on the screen, you'll see that ladder kind of twisted in a helical pattern. So that's the DNA ladder that's just being twisted up tightly. What this shows us is how it is compacted and how it's organized within the cell. So if you take that DNA ladder and you cut a certain span of it, what you'd end up with is what we call genes. If you've ever, heard people talk about your genetic information or your genes, that's what these are. Genes are basically just long spans of the DNA ladder that contain specific instructions about body parts or attributes. So if you have ever wondered why your eyes are green and your siblings' eyes are blue, that's determined by a particular gene or a set of genes that in your body that regulate eye color. Hair color is another example of that. Basically, everything about us is regulated by different combinations of genes in our DNA. So human beings so what you also notice there is that you string a bunch of those genes together, and if you picture the ladder going on infinitely, it's organized into these clusters called nucleosomes, and then eventually all of that is kind of sandwiched into these structures called chromosomes. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of that phrase. So a chromosome is basically just a condensed string of DNA that's organized in sort of like this X shape. Not all of them are shaped like that. But in human beings, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 23 identical pairs, 46 chromosomes total. And that's in every single cell, basically, every single cell in your body. Some cells are a little bit different. But basically, every cell in your body has all 23 of these pairs of chromosomes sandwiched or tightly folded into the nucleus of the cell. That's where you would find this if you could actually dig for it. So that's the organization of DNA. Now we'll talk about how much information is organized in this in just a little bit. But I'll start with this. In your nucleus, the nucleus of just about every cell in your body, if you were to be able to take this chromosome and unravel it end to end with that long DNA ladder, you would have about 6 feet of information that's crammed into a microscopic nucleus of a cell. 6 feet of information that's able to be contained in that because of how tightly it's wound and how it's organized. Now, I'll come back to that in just a moment. But those are the nuts and bolts of DNA. Let's talk about proteins for just a little bit. Proteins are important because they make up basically anything in your body that does work, whether it's metabolism, whether it's structure in your body, whether it's like your skin and how it functions to keep us cool and to keep harmful things out and to kind of serve as a barrier. Protein is like the workhorse in the body. There are proteins that are essential to every process in the human body. Without protein, we would not function. We wouldn't exist. Proteins, how many of you have heard of amino acids? Raise your hand. Okay, so most people have heard of amino acids. Amino acids are to proteins what nucleotides are to DNA. They're the building blocks. In most living organisms, there are 20 amino acids that are used in protein synthesis. And basically all proteins is long strings of amino acids. Just like chromosomes are long strings of DNA, proteins are long strings of amino acid. And that building block I mentioned that's the structure that you see here on the screen. The difference in the 20 amino acids, for anybody that's curious, if you see that R group on the top of this molecule, the thing that makes one amino acid different from another is that R group. Those R groups differ from one amino acid to another. But in a nutshell, this is what we're talking about when we look at proteins. Any comments or questions on that so far? Anything not making sense or just not sounding consistent? Okay. All right. So how do we get from DNA to proteins? So we looked at this long ladder of DNA that stretched out and then folded together into chromosomes. If you think of DNA as a 4-letter alphabet, basically within that long ladder of DNA, if you looked at those rungs are made up of, I mentioned, 4 different bases. That's the DNA alphabet. A, C, G, and T are the letters that are used because they stand for the four bases. But DNA is basically a 4-letter alphabet, and so if you take that ladder and you read it from end to end, or you copy it from end to end, you'd be left with this DNA copy that has a string of one of 4 letters from beginning to end. A, C, G, or T. That's all you've got in a copy of DNA, basically. These copies, once they're made, they're taken outside of the nucleus to another part of the cell, where they're then translated into amino acids. And the way that works is basically in that long string of letters, there's a part of the cell that its whole job is to read those letters in threes. So if DNA is a 4-letter alphabet, the way the alphabet is constructed is always into 3-letter words. You know, our English alphabet, we've got 26 letters, and we have an unlimited number of, we have different lengths of words. Well, in the cellular alphabet, the DNA alphabet is always, it always composes 3-letter words. So there's something in the cell that reads this long strand in chunks of 3 letters at a time. And those 3 letters will tell the cell what kind of amino acid to make. So one amino acid at a time, one chunk of 3 at a time. It's basically putting together a beaded necklace where the beads are the amino acids. And that's how our proteins are made. So that's just a kind of a crash course on what DNA is, what proteins are, and how they fit together. Any questions before we move on? Okay, so here's where hopefully you'll start to see the complexity of this. And this is the kind of thing that is, I guess from my perspective, is maybe the most amazing thing about the human body. So when you think of DNA, I mentioned that it's basically a string of 4 letters. Those 4, that strand can be organized essentially in 4 dimensions. So the first dimension, I mean, if you were to take that strand and string it out and just read it, if that were your job, to read those 4 letters from beginning to end, it would basically read like a linear code. I mentioned that if you stretched it out, all of that material in your nucleus would be 6 feet long. Anybody want to guess how many rungs there would be on that 6-foot ladder? Just ballpark. You can be totally off. I just want to hear a guess. How many rungs do you think would be on that 6-foot ladder?
6 billion.
6 billion. That's actually a really good guess. That's too much. Cut that in half. You have a ladder in the nucleus of every one of your cells that has 3 billion rungs on it. And if you measure it in terms of genes, most of the DNA in your body contains 30,000 genes, and that's just in the nucleus of one cell. So if you take every cell in your body and you string every piece of DNA end to end, beginning to end, all of the genetic information that's in your body, if you were to do that, the total length of human DNA would reach to the sun and back more than 600 times. And that's all in your body. It is unfathomable. Now that's just the first dimension. All right, are you guys impressed by that yet? If you're not, hold on. So the thing with this code, this linear DNA alphabet that reads from beginning to end, is that there are parts of it, when the body processes it, it doesn't just read it in linear fashion. There are parts of that ladder that regulate other parts of the ladder. And so, in other words, there may be a part of your DNA that tells this other part of your DNA when to turn on, when to turn off, when to make copies, when to stop making copies, when to do other cellular functions. But it's all like, it's not just reading this linear strand of DNA, but it's a strand of DNA that regulates and modifies itself as it goes. So there are all of these interactions within that linear code that govern how the code actually functions. Okay, that's the second dimension. Anybody still, actually don't answer that question. Third dimension. If you're still not impressed, here's what happens with that linear code. It folds up on itself in 3 dimensions. And that makes sense because we talked about somehow all that information has to be condensed within the nucleus. So it folds up on itself in 3 dimensions. And what that means is that when you have this piece of DNA that is condensed into a chromosome or condensed into a 3-dimensional shape, there are parts of the DNA that are exposed to the outside that can be read. But there are other parts of the DNA that are turned inside and that aren't read. So whenever that DNA is being copied or whenever it's telling the cell what to do, the shape of that three-dimensional object, the way that the DNA is shaped, plays a large part in determining how that DNA is going to be read and what it's going to cause the cell to do. There are certain parts, certain cells in your body where the way that the DNA is shaped is going to produce things that are, for example, specific to your liver. So the way your DNA is organized in 3 dimensions in your liver is going to be different from the way that it's folded in 3 dimensions in your stomach, or in your blood, or in your bones, or in your lungs. And so that 3-dimensional conformation, I mean, if you just kind of picture like a ball of yarn maybe, and every piece of that, every inch of that ball of yarn has information on it, there are some times where that information, some of that information is going to be concealed, sometimes where parts of it will be readable. But that changes. Remember how I said that within that linear code, you have different parts of it that modify other parts? So how do you think parts of the body, or how do you think DNA knows what shape to fold into? Well, that's governed by other parts of that code. So that's the 3rd dimension. Now the 4th dimension is time. The way that DNA is organized and the way that it shapes in your body does not stay the same for all of your life. It changes over time. So the way that that ball of yarn is organized and the things on that 6-foot-long sequence of DNA within your cell that are important to be read, say, when you're like a baby. At some point, those things might not be as important for your body to copy and duplicate. And so the shape is going to change so that those things are tucked away. And parts of your body that are necessary for maturity and development, for puberty, things like that, those parts are going to be expressed and read at certain times. So it changes over time. It is the most amazing thing that we could ever think of. I mean, computer programmers who do this for a living with computer code really only do this in like the first way, like for the first linear sequence. Writing a code that even modifies itself in 2 dimensions is kind of a crazy thing. So if the brightest humans can design computers, and you think about all the complexity of a computer, and it takes a human to design that, what are the chances that the designer of that complex machine, could happen just by chance? Do you see the contrast there, or the difficulty of that? If we would conclude that a house or a computer or a cell phone could never happen by chance, why would we think that the intelligence behind that, which is infinitely more complex, could somehow arrive in a haphazard fashion? So hopefully that gives you just a sense for the ways that complexity makes an argument for, or points to a creator and not to random chance. So before we go on, the last thing we're going to talk about is something called irreducible complexity, and we may not have a whole lot of time for that. That's okay. But does anybody have any comments on this so far? In what ways does DNA, like all the information that you've heard, even if it doesn't fully make sense, in what ways does that point you to the conclusion of a creator rather than random chance? Alan, yes, sir.
I was reminded of something I saw this week, since it's, once again, the anniversary of the moon landing, that I saw an article that showed a picture of the woman who wrote the computer code that got man to the moon. And the paper, she wrote it all by hand, and the paperwork was as tall as the lady that wrote it.
Wow.
It's that complex. And so would anybody argue that just by chance all those things in the code just would come together in such a way so that man could launch a craft and land on the moon? It's just no one would argue that stack of papers, that all those numbers, and could have just in some random fashion and ended up with the success of the project.
Good. So even if you're looking at it from like a mathematical perspective, like in terms of probability, the probability is essentially or mathematically impossible for this. Very good. So that brings us to something called irreducible complexity. And I asked you to define that. Here's just a brief definition for it. It's the idea that biological systems with multiple parts could not evolve in small steps. And the reason is because if you were to take away any of the parts of that system, it wouldn't function. So you have here on the screen a picture of maybe a simple example of that, a mousetrap. If you've ever kind of played around with a mousetrap, you know how it works. It's got all of these, basically a few simple parts that make it work. It's got the platform, it's got a spring, it's got something that's loaded by the spring to snap onto the animal that's going to be trapped, and then it has to have a pin or some sort of mechanism by which you restrain the spring-loaded snap. So those are the components of it. Pretty simple. But if you were to think about this in an evolutionary sense, okay, we're going to say that this has to happen incrementally in small steps. We've only got basically 4 things to work with here. But what steps are you going to go in? How are you going to put those together in order so that every step of that is functional somehow? Maybe it's functional, but not as a mousetrap. Because if you take away the hook that restrains the snap, the arm, then there's really no function in that. You just have an arm that's kind of snapped closed all the time. And even if you open it up manually, it's just going to snap right back, and it's not going to do any good. If you take the spring off of it, you have an arm, something to hook the arm to, but nothing to anchor the arm to the platform. If you don't have a platform, you've got a spring-loaded arm that you can restrain, but that doesn't have anything to hold on to anchor it, so it's not going to work either. If you take away the arm, you've got a spring and a restraint, but you have nothing to actually trap the animal. So you see the idea there is that every component of that is necessary to the proper functioning of the mousetrap. And that presents some problems to evolutionary claims, because the idea behind evolution is that all of the complexity that exists in the world comes about through a series of small incremental genetic changes or mutations. But in order for those, and Artie mentioned this too, we'll talk about it a little bit next week, in order for those mutations to stick around, they have to be beneficial. Our bodies, I don't know if you guys knew this or not, our bodies mutate constantly. We're basically just a room of mutants, for what it's worth. But when that happens, does anybody know what your body typically does with a mutation?
It degrades.
Okay. Yeah, in fact, in some cases, cancers are a result of mutations, cells that mutate. So it's not a beneficial thing. But even that is sort of a rare thing in terms of the amount of mutation that happens in our bodies. Any other ideas about what happens when a mutation takes place in your body? Like Stan probably just mutated as we speak, but what's his body doing with that? Bruce?
Removing.
Yeah, you have systems in your body that are designed to inspect. And if something's copied wrong or read wrong or produced wrong, then you have systems in your body that are designed to basically take it and throw it away, dispose of it. So our bodies are mutating constantly, but we also have parts of our bodies that are designed to regulate that, to prevent it from propagating. So the point of that is that most mutations that happen in nature, number one, they're not beneficial, but number two, they don't even stick around long enough to be passed on. So for evolution to happen, to work, you have to have mutations that are beneficial enough that your body's not going to get rid of it. It's going to, in other words, beat your body's defense system, and it's going to have a reason to get passed on genetically. And that has to happen in thousands and millions and billions of circumstances for things to go from simple primordial life to the complex life that we see today. Now, the claim is that if you have enough, well, actually, I'll ask you guys, how do evolutionists typically reconcile that? How do they get away with saying that, well, yeah, it's a reasonable thing that many changes could happen? Artie? Time. That's the secret ingredient. Is if given enough time, and they would say, billions of years, millions to billions of years, that those changes could add up. But again, when you look at it from a statistical, a mathematical standpoint, there is not enough time in the universe. No amount of time would lead to those sorts of changes building up and being sustained to lead you from one organism to another. So we'll talk more about that some next week when we look at evolutionary claims, but hopefully that gives you at least a little bit of an idea for how this complexity discussion can work. Wayne and then Bruce.
Well, basically, everything that's organic in the universe deteriorates with time until we improve.
Right. Good. We talked about that idea of entropy. So for things to become more orderly as they mutate just isn't observable. It's not the natural order of things. Good. Bruce.
For almost anything in nature that reproduces, you'd have to have a male and a female to reproduce pointing at the same time, or they can't reproduce and make that happen. So, for those to be exactly the same time to be where they are is just unimaginable also.
Good. Yeah, I don't know that there's ever, and I'm not a scholar on this by any means, but I've never come across a suitable explanation for the nuts and bolts of how that would happen. How would a mutation actually be sustained, like one be sustained over a sequence of generations that would lead to something like that? And I think you also run into the problem of there are no examples of that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. David?
I think it's also interesting that this irreducible complexity was actually developed by a microbiologist who believed in evolution. So when he started studying, this is what convinced him and moved away from his belief of evolution.
Good. So I'll say this, and this will be the last thing I'll say, and we'll close. I think it's really fascinating to hear examples of people like that who go from a place of believing in evolution to belief in some sort of creator. And what I'll say about that is it shows us that there are people who are open-minded and willing to reason in this discussion. And I think hopefully what that does for us is it shows us that we need to be informed enough to be willing to reason as well. To have enough to say and to know what we're saying well enough that in a discussion with somebody, and I'm not saying you have to get into a discussion with a microbiologist or a rocket scientist, but enough to really understand how to make a case and to make sure that as we make a case that it's credible. And it takes open-mindedness and humility on our part to do that as well. All right, thank you all for that. If there was anything you want to go back and ask about, then please talk to me afterward. Don't be shy about that, and I'd be happy to work through some of that with you. But thanks for your good attention and participation. And next week, we'll move on to Lesson 6, Lord willing.